Welcome to UFCW Local 832 SOFA series. We come to you every last Wednesday of the month to try to bring different topics that are relevant to what's going on and things that may be of interest to you. Tonight, we are going to be talking about a subject that's going to be particularly relevant next month in Winnipeg as we head into June and we head into Pride Month. We're going to be talking about how to be an ally, but I do want to give you a little bit of tips on how this works if it's your first time either attending a webinar through Facebook. Some of you have joined us, some of you have joined us through Zoom. The way that it works is on Facebook, you'll be able to ask questions and make comments right there as you're watching. And if you're watching us on Zoom and you go down to the bottom of your screen, you can see it says Q&A right at the bottom. If you click on that, you can ask your questions and we won't be answering them until the end, but I will be keeping track of the things that you would like to talk about. And from there, I will be asking your questions. We won't get to all of them, but we'll do our best. So I said tonight was about getting ready for Pride Month, Pride Week, Pride Weekend. Pride Month, I think. We should get ready for an entire month because goodness knows we need a celebration these days. And that's why tonight we are joined by Bre, who is the Training and Education Coordinator for the Rainbow Resource Center. Thanks, Bre, for being here. We're talking tonight about being a better ally, and we're coming about it from the point of view that perhaps you have questions or maybe terminology that you don't understand and you're not really sure who you should ask about this. So we are creating a safe space where we're going to talk about how to be a better ally, to ask questions, but of course, we're going to be respectful as well. Bre, I'm going to turn it over to you because I know you have a lot to tell us about and I'm really looking forward to what you have to say. And don't forget, folks, you can add your questions and I will be checking with Bre closer to the end, closer to 8 o'clock. Thank you, Bre, take it away.
Perfect. Good evening, everybody. I am going to be sharing my screen. So, Aaron, I cannot share my screen. So we will have to figure that out. But in the meantime, now I'm the host. Maybe I can do it. Perfect. Thank you. That was quick and easy. All right, so hopefully everybody can see that all right. Today we are going to be talking about being an ally to the 2S LGBTQ+ community. As it says on there, my name is Bre Giesbrecht and I am the Training and Education Coordinator at Rainbow Resource Center. So I always like to begin these presentations with a land acknowledgement. We live and work in the territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, Dene, Métis, and Oji Cree nations. I myself am white and I am an uninvited settler on these lands. This is not my land originally. And Rainbow Resource Center, where I am currently sitting in, sits in Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg, which is the ancestral and traditional homeland of the Anishinaabe people. And there is so much that we can learn from Indigenous folks about gender and sexuality and kind of the fluidity of those concepts. We're not going to be getting into it as much today as we would typically do in one of our 3-hour presentations, but just know that so much of the information I'm sharing with you today comes from the Indigenous folks, and so we just want to try to honor and respect where that knowledge comes from. A little introduction about me. My name is Bre. My pronouns are they, them. We're going to be talking about pronouns a little bit more in a bit, but that is just something to be aware of. I am non-binary, and I also use the term queer to describe myself. I also identify as disabled and neurodiverse. If neurodiverse is a term that is new to you, it basically just means I'm somewhere on the autism spectrum. And I am the Training and Education Coordinator at Rainbow Resource Center. So I do presentations like this to workplaces, organizations, post-secondary institutes, things like that. A little bit of information about the Rainbow Resource Center itself. So we are the longest continuously running 2S LGBTQ+ resource center in Canada. We've been around since the 70s, which is pretty impressive if you think of the fact that homosexuality was actually only decriminalized in 1969. So basically, right off the bat, the Rainbow Resource Center popped up and started providing support to the 2S LGBTQ+ community. We have a variety of options of supports. We have the youth program, our older adult program, and we kind of see those two as the pillars, in a sense, of the Rainbow Resource Center, in that those communities are often the most marginalized. and often don't have the supports necessary or don't have the ability to make connections with people. So we offer those programs really directly within the center, especially when it's not COVID. And we also offer free short-term counseling. We have social support groups. So for people who are looking to meet other folks who have similar experiences, we have like a non-binary group. We have a group for men, a group for women, a group for trans folks, and the list goes on. And we also offer diversity and inclusion workshops, which today's presentation would be a variation of what we typically do. And quite broadly, we serve basically everyone. We serve 2S LGBTQ+ individuals themselves, their families and friends, any allies in Manitoba and surrounding places as well, and really anybody who's looking for a bit more information. So the way this is going to be kind of set up today, because we're talking about ways to be an ally, we are going to look at 4 kind of very broad general ways to be an ally with a bit more information kind of underneath each of those. And as Erin said, you are welcome to ask questions in that Q&A or in the Facebook chat, and we will answer them as we go, as we get to the end. So the first thing you can do to be a better ally, really be willing to listen. And the fact that you folks are already here listening to me on a Wednesday evening means that you've already probably done pretty well at this first step. And with being willing to listen, so much of that is being open-minded. It's often easy to listen, but to not really hear what people are saying or to not really be able to take it in. But to be open-minded and to be willing to accept when things change, because the information is constantly changing within the 2S LGBTQ+ community. Even the acronym itself, 2S LGBTQ+, it hasn't always been that acronym. Even in my short time kind of being aware of these concepts, along with many other people, that acronym has already changed many times. And that's something just as small and simple as an acronym, let alone the various definitions for identities, new identities kind of being formed, things like that. So this information is always changing. And so just because you may have been told something once 5 years ago doesn't necessarily mean that it still is accurate. So it does take a lot of open-mindedness to be willing to kind of continue upgrading that information, so to speak. Also, being willing to learn from multiple sources. It's super easy to say, well, Bre from the Rainbow Resource Center said this is true, so it must be true. But if somebody comes up to you and says, hey, like what you just said caused me harm, just because I didn't tell you it causes harm doesn't mean it isn't true. So being willing to take in information from multiple sources, whether that's people from various backgrounds, different age groups, different parts of the world. This information is diverse. The 2S LGBTQ+ community is diverse. And so in order to make sure that you are causing the least harm possible and providing as much support as you can, you're going to have to learn from multiple sources and take in that information from a variety of different places. And finally, with being open-minded, you're going to have to reflect on your discomfort. Some of this information can be very new. It can be confusing. To be quite honest, a lot of people, even within the 2S LGBTQ+ community, don't understand all the other identities. I, for one, don't necessarily understand how it feels to be agender, but that doesn't mean that it's incorrect. It doesn't mean that it's not completely valid. And so reflecting on that discomfort of not necessarily being able to understand a person's experiences, but still being able to support them. Because it's that support that's more important than your ability to understand something. And reflecting on that also can be, learning from your mistakes. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about that later on. But it can be uncomfortable to be learning these things for the first time. So being willing to reflect on that and to grow from it so that you're better supporting the people in your life. And along with listening is acknowledging your privilege. So privilege can sometimes be a term that makes people kind of, like their guard comes up in a sense. But really all that privilege is saying is that some people have it a little easier than other people in certain aspects. Society chooses different things that are kind of valued more, and some of those things you're going to happen to have. So the term intersectionality, which was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, basically the term intersectionality is talking about how different parts of a person's identity or their circumstances intersect or overlap, and they combine to shape someone's life experiences, their marginalization, their power, things like that. So in this kind of daisy or wheel, however you want to see it, these are some of the different areas that a person's identity might have those intersections. So things such as religion, ethnicity, skin color, sex assigned at birth, education, gender, income, culture, geography, age, disability, attraction, and this list can go on. But within each of these categories, there's different levels of marginalization or power, and being willing to acknowledge that there are going to be some areas in which you have privilege and you kind of, in society's eyes, have a little bit more power. So for instance, a person with white skin has more kind of power and faces less marginalization than somebody with darker skin. A person who is heterosexual or straight faces less marginalization or discrimination than somebody who is bisexual or gay. Somebody who is able-bodied faces less discrimination and has more power than somebody who's disabled. And so this list goes on for each of these different categories where you might have privilege that you're unaware of. And being aware of the areas in which you are privileged makes it so that you can use your power for good and ensures that you aren't speaking over those with marginalized identities. So if you want to just take a second to look at this, it's called the Wheel of Power and Privilege. So it's looking at these different areas and recognizing that the areas, the sections that are kind of further to the outside of the circle, how this is set up, those are kind of the identities that are a bit more marginalized. So if you look at kind of that lavender one that says gender, the more marginalized identities would be folks who are trans or intersex or non-binary. Cisgender women face sexism, so they aren't, at the place of the highest power where cisgender men are. So within each of these different categories, there's different levels of privilege. And so being aware of that and being aware of where you fall in each of those can make it easier for you to see the areas in which you have power that you maybe weren't aware of. So for myself, as a queer person who's disabled and neurodiverse, often it feels like, oh my gosh, I'm marginalized in so many ways, but I don't necessarily always think about the fact that I am white. I do speak English. I have gone to post-secondary school. So these are different areas in which I have power that I don't necessarily think of all the time. So it's just a good thing to be aware of, recognizing where you can use power and where you're making sure you aren't speaking over those who have less power, but whose voices need to be heard. All right, so the second step for being an ally is to stay educated. So this is going to be where we cover a few terms that you maybe aren't aware of. And if I'm skimming past anything that you're like, wait, hold up, what the heck are they talking about? Feel free to ask because we can talk about it later. So to start with, the acronym. So I use the acronym 2SLGBTQ+ over and over and over again, but not everybody knows what we're talking about when we use those letters and numbers and symbols. Really, this acronym could be a pretty good password in that it's got letters and numbers and symbols. So perhaps that's something you can think about for the future. But the 2S stands for Two-Spirit. And we aren't going to be going into all of these, but it's something to be aware of. Two-Spirit is a cultural identity. It is specifically for Indigenous folks. And traditionally, it is seen as somebody who holds the spirit of both men or masculinity and women or femininity. For different people, the term means different things, but that is a specifically Indigenous identity. L stands for lesbian. So this could be defined as someone who identifies as a woman who is attracted to other women. G stands for gay, so someone who is a man who is attracted to other men. Bisexual is somebody who is attracted to more than one gender. So it's not necessarily that they're only attracted to men and women. It could be that they're also attracted to non-binary folks or agender folks. The list could go on, but basically just the idea that they're attracted to more than one gender. The T stands for transgender, and this would be individuals where the body that they were born into, their sex assigned at birth, doesn't line up with the way they feel about themselves, their gender identity. And we're going to be talking about that a little bit more yet. Queer or questioning, that Q stands for both. So queer is an umbrella term. It covers the entire community as a whole, but also it can be used specifically as an identity term. And questioning basically just is keeping space within the community for people who aren't totally sure. Just because they don't have it 100% figured out doesn't mean there isn't space for them. And then finally, the plus. And I would argue that the plus is the most important part of the acronym. So often it's left off, but that plus is there to represent all of the identities that don't fall within this acronym, because the list doesn't end at the Q. The community isn't only made up of two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer questioning people. There are so many other identities that fall outside of those, and it's important to recognize that that isn't the end of the list, and there are identities that exist out there. We just can't necessarily include them all in the acronym because it already feels really long sometimes. So, but ensuring that you have that plus at the end, make sure that you're aware that there are other identities out there. So some of the things that are important to differentiate between when you're keeping yourself educated. And we're going to be going into each of these very briefly. But the first one is sex assigned at birth, then gender identity, gender expression, attraction, and culture. So these are 5 separate areas that work together to create a person's identity and kind of form who they are. But they are 5 separate ideas. So we're going to be looking at them briefly. If you have questions, of course, ask. But we don't have time to go into it completely. So sex assigned at birth on this little unicorn is represented by the DNA strand, and that is because it has to do with a person's body and biology. It is all the things that a person is born with physically. So it's also the classification of a person based on those biological characteristics. So things such as chromosomes, hormones, external genitalia, and reproductive organs. Often when people think of sex assigned at birth, they're kind of only thinking of external genitalia or reproductive organs, but chromosomes and hormones have just as big a part in a person's sex assigned at birth as well. So that is something to be aware of, that so much of it people don't even take into consideration. So there are 3 sexes assigned at birth. There's male, female, and intersex. All 3 are completely valid, common sexes assigned at birth. However, I think everybody here can recognize and understand that most of the time people only think about female or male. They kind of see sex assigned at birth as a binary, as 2 kind of options. However, intersex actually happens pretty frequently. Intersex people are born or they discover their intersex later on. We're not going to be talking about it too much today, but if you have any questions or anything, feel free to ask. But something to keep in mind is that sex assigned at birth is not visible. So there certainly are aspects that could be visible at certain times, but with a person just walking down the street, you can't see their chromosomes, you can't see their hormones, you can't see their external genitalia, you can't see their reproductive organs. So assuming a person is fully clothed, you can't see their sex assigned at birth. So basically what this is saying is don't make assumptions just based off of the way a person's face looks or the way their body looks, not making an assumption of what their sex assigned at birth is. All right, the next one is gender identity. So gender identity is represented by the little rainbow in the thought bubble, and that is because gender identity is a person's innate sense of self. It's their internal and individual lived experience of what it means to be a woman, a man, neither, or a mix of many genders. It is completely individual to every single person, because everybody experiences it a little bit differently. Something to really keep in mind is that gender identity and sex are not the same thing. So sex or sex assigned at birth is something that a person is born with. It is formed in utero, and it is something that is completely biological, whereas gender identity is something that is a person's sense of who they are. So keeping in mind that those don't always line up. So some of the different gender identities that exist, and we aren't going to be going into all of these definitions unless people ask, but some of the gender identities that are out there would be woman, man, agender, non-binary, gender fluid, and this list goes on. So there are many, many different identities that fall within gender identity, but something to keep in mind is that none of them are visible. So by looking at a person, you can't see what their experience is. You can't see what their relationship to being a woman or a man or neither or a mix of many genders. You can't see that connection that they have. And so making sure that you aren't making assumptions. If you see a person just based off of how they look, you can't tell how they're feeling about themselves internally. So making sure that you're aware of the fact that gender identity is not something you can see. Gender is something that we grow into. So it is not something that we are born with. A baby that has just been born isn't going to have a concept of whether they are a girl or a boy, or kind of somewhere outside of that, because they're just kind of existing. Gender is something that forms over time, and we learn it from the way our families treat us, the culture we live in, society, all of those expectations that are kind of placed on a person, that kind of forms a person's gender and like their understanding of how they relate to gender. For some people, their gender identity maybe doesn't correspond with the expectations that are kind of placed on them based off of the sex they were assigned at birth. So for somebody who is assigned female at birth, they maybe don't feel that way about themselves. There's certain social expectations that maybe doesn't fit for them. And so being aware that not everybody kind of has that same experience. For folks where their gender identity does line up with the sex they were assigned at birth, the term for that is cisgender. And cisgender basically just means a person whose gender is the same as the sex they were assigned at birth. That gender identity lines up with what is expected of them based off of the body they were born into. So for the most part, this would be somebody who is assigned female at birth, whose gender identity would be that of a woman, where it lines up, or somebody who is assigned male at birth, where their gender identity is that of a man, kind of that lines up. However, for a large portion of the population, it doesn't happen to line up for them. So the term for that is gender diverse. And gender diverse is an umbrella term, but basically what it means is any identities that don't align with the social norms of gender. Any of those identities that exist outside of that kind of perfect magical alignment of gender identity and sex assigned at birth. And as I said, there are a variety of identities that fall underneath the gender diverse umbrella. Could be transgender, agender, non-binary, gender fluid, gender queer, the list goes on. The most recent estimate of how many kind of gender identities there are is approximately 1,500. So that's 1,500 different gender identities. And so there's probably no way you're ever going to know all the definitions, have a full understanding of all of them. But really what's most important is recognizing that there are these differences, because while the number might be 1,500, if you ask one woman what it means to her to be a woman, she's probably going to have a different answer than if you ask the next woman. And that is because different people have different relations to their gender. Everybody experiences it a little bit differently. So it could be argued that there's an infinite number of gender identities because every single person experiences it a little bit differently. So our next category is gender expression. And this is the way a person presents and communicates gender within a social context. So on the unicorn, it's represented by that kind of bracket offside of the unicorn. because it is all of those external communication. It's the way a person shows their gender and how they kind of want to express it. The ways in which gender is expressed are culturally specific and may change over time. So from culture to culture, there's different expectations of what men wear or what women wear. And over time, what is kind of acceptable for different genders based off of society's expectations, it changes over time. So for instance, high heels were originally invented for men to make them look taller, which was considered being very masculine would be to be taller. However, now most people would associate high heels with women. So that's one of the ways that gender expression has changed over time. And so it's just that reminder that, you know, society creates these rules, but we don't have to follow these rules. So there's a few terms that are good to keep in mind when you're talking about gender expression. So the terms would be masculine, feminine, and androgynous. So the term masculine basically means any gender expression that we would typically associate with men. The term feminine are gender expressions that we would typically associate with women. And then androgynous are things where it really doesn't have an association with either men or with women. It just is completely like gender neutral, so to speak. And gender expression is visible. So of the different areas that we're looking at today, gender expression is the only one that you can see. So if you see a person walking down the street and they drop their umbrella, rather than saying, "Excuse me, sir, hey, somebody stop that man, he dropped his umbrella," you don't know what his gender is. You don't know that he identifies as a man. You don't know if his pronouns are he, him. So instead, describing what you're seeing, describing that expression instead would be a better way to be an ally to make sure that you aren't making those assumptions about people. So it could instead be, you know, "Excuse me, you in the red coat, I think this is your umbrella," whatever it is, but without making those assumptions of gender. So gender can be expressed in a variety of different ways. Things such as hair, clothing, makeup, grooming, how we move our bodies, how we talk, the emphasis or de-emphasis of bodily characteristics or behaviors, a person's chosen name, the pronouns they use, and just keeping in mind that a person is usually happiest and healthiest when their gender expression aligns with their gender identity, and when they feel safe to do so. So pronouns are a huge topic. We aren't going to go into them too in depth, but using the correct pronouns is one of the most important aspects of being a good ally. It's kind of a hot topic in a sense, and that's because it is so important for different people. So on the screen here, you can see a variety of different pronouns that exist. This list is not exhaustive. There are other pronouns that exist outside of this list as well, but they are just some to be aware of. So pronouns such as she, her, he, him, they, them, sie, zir, here, here, or sie, them. As I said, those aren't all of them, but being aware that there are pronouns that exist outside of she and he, because that's what society is most comfortable with, it's most used to, but it's up to you to get comfortable with pronouns other than just she, her, and he, him. So one of the ways you can do that is to just ask people what their pronouns are. So when you're meeting somebody for the first time, especially if it's someone you're going to be communicating with a bit more often, asking, "What pronouns do you use?" Or saying, "Hey, nice to meet you. My pronouns are they, them. What are yours?" So by modeling it, you can also be a good example and make it not feel like you're kind of calling somebody out. But I read a quote once that says something along the lines of, "To assume a person's pronouns is to answer a question you haven't even asked." Because if you aren't willing to take the 5 seconds to ask a person what their pronouns are, you really are just making an assumption about who they are. And something to avoid, and this is kind of newer information in a sense, but we avoid saying preferred pronouns. And that is just because somebody who is using the same pronouns that they were kind of given at birth, nobody ever calls those their preferred pronouns because they've always used it. However, when a gender diverse individual chooses to change their pronouns, now all of a sudden people start saying, "Oh, they prefer she, her," or whatever their pronouns are. And it really isn't a preference. Pronouns are kind of either right or wrong. So instead just saying, "What are your pronouns?" Or actually their pronouns are they, them, without saying preferred pronouns. All right, attraction. So attraction on the unicorn is represented by the little hearts, and that is because it is a person's potential for emotional, intellectual, spiritual, intimate, romantic, and or sexual interest in other people's. There are a variety of ways that attraction can show up, and it can vary based on person to person. So often attraction is kind of reduced down to sexual orientation, which is kind of not the full picture, which is why we use just the term attraction as a general term. There's a variety of different identities that fall under attraction. So there would be straight or heterosexual, gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, asexual, and again, that list goes on. But being aware of the fact that different people are attracted to other people. Just because you aren't attracted to someone doesn't mean they aren't allowed to be. And again, being aware that attraction is not visible. If you are kind of guessing or assuming that somebody is gay or a lesbian, you're probably just kind of falling into stereotypes, which are very harmful. So making sure that you aren't making any assumptions about anybody. And this also means not assuming somebody is straight, because gay and lesbian and bisexual, etc., people exist in all spaces. So just not making any assumptions in any direction. So for attraction, a person could be attracted to a different gender from their own, the same gender as their own, or more than one gender. There's so many different ways in which it can show up, so many different combinations. And a person's understanding of their attraction to others may change and be fluid over time. For the most part, we're all human. Nobody has it all figured out right from the very beginning. I certainly have learned new things about myself over time. So giving people that freedom and the space to change their understandings as they learn and grow more into themselves. And finally, our last one that's worth noting is culture. And culture is just looking at those identities where the culture they come from greatly impacts their identity within the 2S LGBTQ+ community. So it's honoring that diverse, fluid nature of gender, attraction, and then the connections to community, spirituality, and traditional worldviews. So this is where I was talking about that Indigenous folks have always had a more fluid, open-minded understanding of 2S LGBTQ+ issues. And so we want to look at it to also be able to reflect on and restore some of those traditions that colonization took away. Through colonization from Europe, so many of those traditional beliefs were stripped from the communities. So we want to be able to recognize that as well. So some of the identities that could fall under cultural identities would be Two-Spirit, Indigenqueer, Katoi. Katoi is a Thai term for the English equivalent would be ladyboys. Often they would be seen kind of as the equivalent to trans women. And there's a variety of other identities that exist as well. But culture, again, is not visible. You can't make those assumptions about a person's culture based off of what they look like. So making sure that you're being aware of that. All right. The third way that you can be an ally is recognizing systems of oppression, recognizing the areas in which 2S LGBTQ+ people might not have as much power as non-2S LGBTQ+ people. So cis-sexism and cis-normativity, so the definitions for those would be cis-sexism is the belief that cisgender people's identities are more natural and legitimate than those of gender diverse people. And cis-normativity is the assumption that all or almost all individuals are cisgender. It shows up in a variety of ways. Like I've already kind of harped on you, assuming pronouns, because that's assuming that somebody, based off of how they look, is a certain gender identity. Asking for someone's real name or asking if their name is their real name. Only having male or female options on forms, or I don't even know if it's better, but sometimes they have male, female, or other. That is just kind of erasing the space for gender diverse people to exist. The inadequate representation in media, not having those examples in media for people to look up to. And then language that includes gender, so things such as pregnant women or feminine products, because there are trans men who can get pregnant or who menstruate. There are non-binary folks who can get pregnant or who menstruate. There's agender folks. The list goes on. So instead saying pregnant people or menstrual products, taking the gender out of it to make sure that you aren't excluding communities that also would fit into that. Then there's heterosexism and heteronormativity. So the belief that heterosexual people's attraction is the default or normal mode of attraction. Heteronormativity is that assumption that all or almost all individuals are heterosexual. Shows up in a variety of ways again. So seeing being gay as a phase, that it's just something someone's working through before getting back to normal, so to speak. Again, a lack of media representation. It's slowly getting better, but still most kind of media representation is the kind of painful teenage coming out story. There aren't a lot of just, Hallmark Christmas movies that have a queer couple as the main couple. Parental disapproval or really disapproval from anybody, the idea that it's something somebody could just not approve of. Forcing people to come out, because most people don't have to sit their parents down and say, hey, I just feel like I need to let you know that I'm actually straight. People don't have to have that conversation, but for some reason, if somebody isn't straight, if they aren't kind of that default or normal mode of attraction, it's as though they have to admit to something. And finally, so often queer relationships are seen as inappropriate. Even though, we all grow up watching those Disney movies of the prince and the princess kissing over and over again, if it would be two princesses, now all of a sudden it's seen as inappropriate or too mature. So just this idea that even though it's the exact same action, the exact same form of relationship, based off of the gender that people are, it's seen as either inappropriate or appropriate. So there's a variety of issues that are faced by 2S LGBTQ+ folks. There's going to be a bunch that pop up on the screen here. We are not going to talk about all of them. But again, this is a great place for, if you have questions, you might find them on the slide. So fitting into gender norm expectations, the dissociation of body and identity, internalized shame, fear, and guilt, compromised relationships with family and friends, navigating dating and relationships, navigating sexuality, sexual expression, and sexual behavior, the fear of talking about their experiences to healthcare providers, conversion therapy, wearing different masks, so kind of being out to different people at home or at school or at work, mental health issues, internalizing phobias, reconciling that they have fewer life choices, and navigating gendered spaces. So this isn't even the full list, but these are some of the things that 2S LGBTQ+ folks have to think about basically every single day. And the more you're aware of them, the easier it can be to help 2S LGBTQ+ folks navigate these situations so that you're being an ally and you're being a support system for those people who are struggling with these really heavy topics. All right, and number 4, our last thing before we kind of wrap up, is learning from your mistakes. So everybody makes mistakes. I'm constantly making mistakes, even though I am in the community. So making sure that you are aware of how to fix your mistakes. So mistakes do happen, especially if you're learning somebody's new pronouns or their new name. One of the best things you can do is listen. Make sure that you're listening for mistakes, listening for times when you mess it up. Also listening and correcting other people. Saying sorry if you've caused harm, but more importantly, saying thank you. If somebody corrects you, just say thanks, correct yourself, and then continue the conversation. Move on. Don't make the whole thing about, how you're so sorry and how you meant to do better and how, it's just really hard for you. Just continue the conversation. You made a mistake. It's no big deal. And then acting differently. It could be, practicing when you get home. It for sure should be making sure that you're spending less time making fewer mistakes within that conversation, slowing down, making sure that you are being more cognizant of the words you're using. And then finally, for language, there's a whole bunch on the screen here, but little changes to your language can make a huge difference for people seeing you as an ally. So instead of using gender terms such as ladies and gentlemen or guys, using terms that have no gender associated with them. So folks, participants, everyone, hey friends, anything like that that doesn't have gender associated. Making sure if you're talking about women, if you're saying women and trans women or men and trans men, it makes it sound like trans women aren't real women or trans men aren't real men. So instead, you could probably just say women, or you could say cis and trans women, or you could just say men or say cis and trans men, but making sure you aren't making it sound as though it's normal women and trans women. And then the language you use when you're describing how a person talks about themselves. So instead of saying people who consider themselves or people who identify as, just using those terms as adjectives, saying non-binary people or agender people or, Bre, who is non-binary, whatever it is, rather than always having that kind of language in there that makes it sound as though it was a choice. When you're talking about information that kind of comes out, saying, instead of her secret was exposed, making it sound like something that's shameful, you could talk about her history was publicized, which just kind of makes it sound less like a shameful past and more like information that just wasn't meant to be public. Terms such as tranny or transgendered are used as slurs, so making sure that you're using the correct terms such as transgender, trans, or gender diverse. And then with basically any identity, putting the in front of it. So instead of saying, oh, I talked to a transgender or I talked to a gay, using those terms as adjectives, not making a person's entire identity that one term, making sure you're using it as adjectives and still making them into a person, not dehumanizing them. And then finally, for lots of people, the term homosexual is associated with criminalization or mental illness, when those are the kinds of, when that was the term that was used as such a negative term. So using the language that a person uses for themselves. If they call themselves gay, you use the term gay. If they call themselves a lesbian, you use the term lesbian. And the same goes for the term queer, because the term queer was originally used as a slur. If somebody doesn't call themselves queer, if they only use the term gay, don't use the term queer to describe them, only using the language that they use. All right, Erin, are there questions you want me to answer?
Yes, thank you. First of all, Bre, off the top, you always make this such a comfortable place for people to feel like they can ask questions and not feel like it's wrong not to know the answer. So I really appreciate that, and I think that the folks who have questions also do. One of the first ones that I wanted to share, because I think it might be a question that more than one person has, is this one. What if I'm not sure how the other person identifies? Can I just ask?
Totally. That is a very valid question. I think it depends a lot on your relationship with the person. For the most part, it's always safe to ask somebody their pronouns. That is definitely something that you're always safe to do. If somebody doesn't feel comfortable telling you their pronouns, respecting that as well. But often it also is a matter of thinking to yourself, do I need to know what label they use for their gender identity? Do I need to know if they're agender or gender fluid, or can I just ask their pronouns and then I know how to talk about them? Maybe you don't need that label for your information. But if you don't have the chance to ask somebody their pronouns, defaulting to gender neutral pronouns is definitely your best bet.
I think that's a really good point that you make, Bre, is it something that really matters? If it's the cashier at the grocery store, does it really matter if you know how they identify? It's not really relevant to the transaction. So That's a really good point to keep in mind. This is a kind of a big question, and I don't know if we could answer it even in the next 15 minutes, but a good question. How can I make somebody feel comfortable? So, if we use the scenario, perhaps it's somebody new in the workplace, or maybe it's someone new to your friend group. What can you do to signal? And we're talking, I think we're talking coming from a cisgendered person. What can I do to make somebody else feel comfortable?
Totally. And that is a big question, right? And it's a question that is relevant even outside of this topic, because that's where, if we look at that intersectionality and the different forms of kind of power that people have, there's different things that people might feel uncomfortable about. One of the ways that we talk about for specifically the 2S LGBTQ plus community is using your pronouns wherever possible. So if you can see on our screen, I have my pronouns on my Zoom name. Erin also has hers. So if you are, participating in a lot of Zoom meetings, that's one way that you can do it. Put your pronouns in there. You can also put your pronouns in like your social media. Instagram now lets you put it, it goes right beside your name if you add your pronouns. You can put it on Facebook, anything like that shows that you're at least aware of these conversations. Even if you're like, I don't know my pronouns, people only call me she, her, then those are your pronouns. Everybody has pronouns. And if you kind of are willing to have those conversations, and by asking people their pronouns, it shows that you're at least somebody who's aware of these concepts. And that can make a huge difference. So often, it's not necessarily going to be that you wear pride flags every single day and you have like pride flags all over your office space. That might honestly kind of just freak people out. But it's the way you interact with them, not making assumptions, not staring if somebody's wearing nail polish that you're like, oh, why are they wearing nail polish? Kind of being just that open-minded, not making assumptions. And if somebody kind of tells you something that's maybe a bit of a surprise to you, addressing it within yourself, thinking, why was that such a surprise? What assumptions was I making that was surprising to me? Because if you're surprised about anything, you've been making assumptions. So often it's just kind of making sure that the way you're reacting isn't making somebody feel uncomfortable.
So I guess we don't even have to be talking about in a new workplace or a new colleague or something like that. It could be just maybe changing the way you're doing things now in your existing workplace, because you don't know how everybody identifies and you maybe are just assuming it and haven't really made a comfortable place for someone to be more open as to who they are.
Totally. And I know when I changed my pronouns, I made an effort to ask my family members. I asked my sisters, I was like, hey, I've never asked you, what are your pronouns? And they were like, oh, she, her. And I'm like, okay, well, at least now I've asked. I've known you for the last 26 years, but I never bothered to ask. So it could even be something like that now, going after this presentation and sending out an email saying, hey, I want to make sure I'm using the correct pronouns for people. Something as simple as that.
You sort of covered this question, but I think it's worth reiterating again. What if you make a mistake? What if you are in a public washroom, perhaps, and you say to someone, oh, I think you're in the wrong washroom. But they are in the washroom that they belong in, that they do need to be in. What do? If you're kind of embarrassed, you might feel a little defensive. How do you handle that kind of a mistake?
Totally. And that is something that even I'm still working on. As somebody who has social anxiety, my gosh, I overthink every single interaction I have. So then when you make a mistake, it's like, how could I do that? Like, such a silly mistake. But I think so much of it is also having, some sympathy for yourself, realizing that every single person makes mistakes. I myself use gender neutral pronouns, and the number of times I mess up other people's pronouns when they use gender neutral pronouns, it happens constantly. And so just recognizing that this is hard for everybody. It's hard for people who, their pronouns have been what they are for the last 20 years. I misgender myself sometimes, where I'll be like, oh, it's me, your girl. And then I'll be like, what on earth am I talking about? So just recognizing that every single person makes mistakes. You are not alone in that. But it's how you respond to that mistake by, like saying thank you if there's a correction, or apologizing. In your example of the bathroom, if someone says, no, this is my bathroom, then just say like, so sorry, just wanted to make sure you were feeling comfortable. Whatever it is, because probably you're probably trying to do it out of, good intentions. And that doesn't necessarily mean you won't cause harm. But, having some sympathy for yourself, knowing that everybody makes mistakes and you know what your intentions were, and apologizing for the harm.
I think you raised a really good point, and you brought it in earlier, to just either to thank someone for correcting you or to apologize that someone that you've made a mistake, but not to make it about yourself in that moment. And maybe later on you want to go and think about, oh, why did I make that mistake? How can I handle things differently? But you don't need to put that on the person who you're apologizing to. And that would be true in whatever you're apologizing for.
Absolutely.
I think also, what I'm getting from what you've been saying is that you trust people that they know who they are. So if someone says to you, this is who I am, and even if you think, well, that's not what you look like to me, or that's not how I identify you, that's not really as important as just trusting people that they know who they are.
Absolutely. We always say people are the experts on themselves. And it sometimes is a hard thing to keep in mind because society teaches us to make those assumptions. So having to kind of break down something you've always been taught to do is definitely difficult.
And probably even more so if it's a family member or perhaps one of your children that you've already had an idea of who this person is. And it might be hard for you to reconcile that's not exactly how that person has felt. It's another big question. And, I don't want to run out of time, but we do have so many questions. One person, and I don't know if you're qualified to answer this, Bre, but how do I answer young kids' questions? How do I talk to my kids about someone they see, something they've heard?
Absolutely. And that is a question that so many people have. And because as I was saying, gay relationships are seen as inappropriate. And there's so often people are like, well, how do I talk to my kids about the fact that, there's gay people? And it's like, well, they're seeing heterosexual couples all the time. So why is one more inappropriate than the other? So especially when it comes to things like attraction, if you're comfortable with them watching Cinderella and having Cinderella kiss Prince Charming and that doesn't bother you, if they see two men kissing at the park, why is that now, like, oh gosh, how do I talk to them about this? Because really it can just be, oh, like sometimes people kiss, like it doesn't have to even be this question of, like when is a good time to tell them? Because it really should just exist from the beginning. If you want your kids to grow up being understanding and not have to kind of grapple with these ideas later on, the earlier the better, I think, and even concepts of gender. This idea that if you have a daughter who wants to play with a truck, or if you have a son who wants to play with Barbies, it doesn't have to be this whole like conversation of, no, you're a boy, you play with this, but just letting people exist. And then letting your kids know that people exist. People like different things. People feel different ways about themselves. And that freedom to just be who they are, not necessarily fit into what society wants them to be. And it is hard.
You also have to not swing too far the other way as well, is that if your child does things that are not typically identified with their born gender, don't immediately assume like, oh, okay, well, I need to all of a sudden treat my child like maybe that they're questioning their gender. I mean, I think you just need to leave people the space to figure these things out and to share it when they're ready.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I know when my kids were little, there was the horror when you're in the grocery store that they will point out something about anybody and say it very loudly and ask a question and not just about somebody's gender, but just that's what kids tend to do, is they will say a question loudly. And as a parent, you feel really uncomfortable and you maybe feel a little bit embarrassed. Do you have some tips on how to handle that sort of situation when it does come to gender and how people are identifying?
Totally. And I think that's where being proactive is super important, having these conversations before you're going out in public, because your kids are going to see people who are expressing their gender differently. It's becoming more and more popular. And especially now with quarantine, the number of people who are feeling more comfortable to express their gender because they've been alone. They haven't felt society's pressure to like fit into a certain mold. So it's going to be more and more common. So having those conversations, there's so many awesome kids shows even nowadays that have gender diverse characters, and having those conversations in the home so that when you're going out, it's less likely to happen. But if it does, again, reiterating, oh, people wear different clothes, you're wearing a blue t-shirt and that person's wearing a skirt. Like we all are wearing clothes. Like you know, whatever it is, making sure that you're just normalizing it, because your child is also going to be hearing that. And if, you know, they are suddenly grappling with something, or kind of trying to figure out what they want to wear or how they want to look, if you say like, oh, don't say that about somebody, that's so rude, or whatever, now they're kind of associating that with a negative thought. So just normalizing it, just kind of saying, you know, oh yeah, like people hold hands, oh, people wear clothes, you know, anybody can wear the color pink, like whatever it is, just making it seem totally normal, because it is. And that's the thing that we're trying to work towards, is that all of these identities are normal. We just have a very wide range of what normal is.
That's probably a good thing for all of us. There's a general question that I think would probably cover a lot of what people are curious about. Is where can I learn more? We spoke for 45 minutes. People probably still have more questions about genders, about terminology, all kinds of things. Where can people learn more if they have more questions?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm biased, but the Rainbow Resource Center is awesome. You are always welcome to reach out to me. And I can share my contact information. Erin has my contact information as well. We are happy here to provide answers, but also the internet is honestly a great place. And that's where it also, as I was talking about, you know, finding multiple sources. If you're like, wow, okay, I had never heard of, you know, gender identity as something different than gender expression, you'll find a lot of that on the internet. It just takes a little bit of time to dig. But, you know, reaching out to people in your life who might have some ideas, you know, not always relying on queer folks to educate you, but, you know, asking for personal experiences, perhaps, talking to people such as us at the Rainbow Resource Center. We are here to answer your questions, and that is literally what a community resource center is for. So if you have more questions, reach out. There's also lots of like YouTube videos, websites, things like that, where we often find our information as well, because we are not experts on the entire community. So there's tons of information out there. Sometimes it just takes a bit to dig through it all.
And maybe that's part of your responsibility to do, is to educate yourself by figuring out where those resources are. Bre, I don't think you're going to make the plug, but I'm going to, because the Rainbow Resource Center does rely on donations. So for anybody who's been listening tonight who wants to support the work that you do, they can also get in touch to make a donation as well. I'm going to assume that that would be okay with you.
Yes, absolutely. We do, of course, we're a nonprofit, so we do, of course, take donations, and it all goes back into the community, which is amazing. It is part of the reason that we can offer the programs we do and the support groups and things like that.
You did a fantastic job tonight. I think you covered a heck of a lot of stuff in a very short period of time, and certainly gave people options when they might have some more questions where to go. So I really appreciate the time that you spent with us tonight, Bre. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank
I
you.
also want to thank everybody who joined us, whether by Zoom or on Facebook. This is a presentation that is open to everybody, but it is put on by UFCW Local 832. We're a union that's right across Manitoba, this particular local, but we are a union that's actually international. If you're tuning in, but you don't know much about unions and you're wondering what else do we do, there is lots of ways to get some more information, and I'm going to show that to you in just a minute. I have to figure out how to make myself the host again.
I might have to do it.
Bre has all the power right now. So if you'd like to know more about UFCW, if you'd like to know more about what it is to be in a union, you can always go to our website, ufcw832.com. When you go there, it'll show you right on the front page of how can I join a union? What do I need to know about a union? You can give us a call, and we do stuff like this. We try to educate people, but we also do a whole lot of other things to make people more comfortable in the workplace, to make their jobs safer and more fair. And we also like to make a difference in the community, which is why we invite community members to join us like we did tonight. So thank you, Bre. Thank you, everyone. For more information, you can go to our website, or you can also go to the Rainbow Resource Center website. Have a great evening, and thanks for being here.